turns out that one of the constants of human history actually is the pursuit of opportunity over space during, as history moves forward. So people are always moving geographically. There's a sense that I think amongst many people that migration is the exception to the rule, and that's where a lot of the tensions come from.
That's Dr. Jeffrey Helgeson, chair and associate professor of history at Texas State University. And his point is where this series begins. Movement is not the exception in history. It is one of history's oldest patterns. This is the first of a 3-part Lone Star Lore series on migration, immigration, and the history of movement in and out of Texas. Before we enter the politics of the present, we're going back into the deeper story, because Texas has never been still. People moved through this land long before modern borders existed. Later, empires and nations tried to manage that movement through law, war, borders, labor systems, and settlement policy. So the question is not whether people move. People have always moved. The harder question is this: who controls that movement? Who benefits from it? Who fears it? Who's protected by the law? Who's punished by it? And what happens when human life and public order collide?
As a historian, right, I am fundamentally committed to being rooted in the sources, to being able to say, okay, I don't actually know what I'm talking about. I don't have opinions about the world unless I go to the sources and actually find something that I can say that's rooted in somebody's actual experience. And I have to be open to the fact that I could be wrong. The way that you know that somebody's a good historian isn't that they were right or wrong about the past. The way that you know that somebody was a good historian is that they told the story with all the sources that they could find and then documented all of that so that later generations of historians can go back and check that with those sources, could that be a reasonable conclusion about the world? And if that's not true, if they ignored sources or the trail of sources told them that this was the reality, but because of their ideology or because of their desire to be famous or their desire to, be popular with their colleagues, they told a different story, then they're a bad historian. I mean, in some ways, it's like the Rosetta Stone for seeing through political slogans around things like migration and immigration. When you hear somebody say illegal immigrant, that that's not a term in the law. That's a political slogan that's created to gain power over the conditions of of any given time and place, right? People who use that term are using it. Maybe they're using it naively. Maybe they think, right? I'm not saying everybody uses that term, but the people who are using it, as part of a sort of political project are using it for those reasons. Now, the people who say in response that the United States is an immigrant nation and we should all just celebrate difference, they're also missing the complexity of the history. That's also a political slogan that prevents us from seeing the complexity of the difference between voluntary immigration and forced migrations. The notion that we're just like an immigrant nation is as confusing and as obscuring as the notion of illegal immigrant. I think that neither one of those are historical perspectives.
There are real concerns on every side of this story. A country has to think seriously about law, sovereignty, borders, public trust, and the institutions that hold a society together. And a society also has to think seriously about human beings, about families, work, fear, displacement, survival, opportunity, and hope. Those concerns do not begin in the present. So before we arrive at the modern debate, we begin where Texas begins, with movement.
Let's examine this issue of immigration from a historical perspective. This is Texas history from a broader angle than we usually expose it to on Lone Star Lore. In the beginning, whenever the beginning was, let's say pre-Columbian, so 1491, Texas was inhabited by indigenous peoples of many groups, speaking multiple languages and living distinctly different lives in places, and very similar lives in other places across this land that was to become Texas. They were immigrants also, migrating down over many centuries across the North American continent, and then many more centuries through Central America and South America. but we will stick to the first Europeans we can trace to Texas. In 1492, on the cusp of the 16th century, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and banged into what he thought was the Indies. His theory of a round world in which he could sail west to reach the east was a sound one, but he miscalculated the size of this piece of molten rock we sit on in this galaxy of many in the universe. His estimate was too small. The land he failed to reckon with in his calculations turned out to be just about the size of the North, Central, and South American land masses. We Texans, along with many others, sat right smack dab in Columbus's way. In 1528, the first Europeans set their tired and weary bodies on Texas soil. Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 other men, including an African slave named Esteban, pulled their wretched little raft and their starving selves onto the Texas shore near Galveston. They were the last known survivors of a party of over 300 who had left Cuba, attempting to reach the Aztec Empire almost 2 years earlier. As far as we know, only Cabeza de Vaca and his not very merry band had managed to not drown, die of disease or starvation. They stayed nearly 8 years, wandering around Texas and the Southwest, and then they went to Mexico, and finally back to Spain. They didn't stay here, but what they did do was tell a lot of people in the European world what they'd seen. So first, explorers started to filter into the future state, and then more and more Europeans followed. By the 16th and 17th century, Texas and other areas of the Southwest were speckled along lakes, rivers, and stream beds. Early on, they tended to be missionaries attempting to convert the natives to Christianity and Catholicism. Remains of their attempts dot the state, but the most complete impact of their presence has been preserved in the mission system of San Antonio. So by 1750, Texas had native peoples, Spanish, and a few others. That's the ready ingredients for a fine mixing of the ethnic soup. All we needed now was some seasoning. It came in the form of the newly mended United States to the north. Mexico began inviting Anglos into Texas in 1821. Known as the, quote, Old 300, unquote, those first families signified the official opening of the floodgates of Anglos.
By the mid-1700s, this was still Spanish Texas, part of New Spain. Mexico did not yet exist as an independent nation, and the United States had not yet entered the Texas story in a formal way. That changed in the early 1800s. Mexico's independence movement began in 1810, shaped in part by the same age of revolutions that had produced the United States. After more than a decade of war and political struggle, Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821. And with independence came a problem. How would a new government in Mexico City control a vast northern frontier far from the center of power? One answer was settlement.
A state that's centralized in Mexico City, a long way away from here, especially in the 19th century, right? You're thinking about trying to bring order to a state that has just gone through a massive political upheaval in the 1820s, right? And so there is an attempt to try to consolidate control over an area where there were a lot of people already living, and there were a lot of people with contending claims to land, contending claims to institutional outlooks, contending claims to religious perspectives, right? And I think that there's an attempt to try to have proxies for the state in what we now think of as Texas.
Yeah, I think I had read at one point that they kind of used that term to govern is to populate, and that maybe even part of it was bringing people in part in North Mexico. At that time, North Mexico and Texas was sort of a hotspot for Comanche warriors could become, and you have to clash with them. That potentially some of the Anglo-Americans were even brought in. All right, you can have cheap land, you can escape whatever you're trying to escape, but the catch is that you're in a space that is not really developed,
right? And
you also are going to have these problems. You can deal with those,
right? Yeah, and it's interesting when you say to populate is to govern. I mean that idea of the peopling of a new colonial territory is one of the most sort of constant, ambitions, tensions in the history of colonialism. You can actually go back through British history, for example, and trace this idea through the making of law and the making of the kind of government projects that were trying to create a world in North America that would be British, right? So the Mexican government is doing something that the British did, that the French did, that the Spanish did, the Dutch did, right? And so it's, I think that there is this, idea that you can, take care of your problems through proxies of people who are willing to take the risks and have an incentive, right? And there is that, it's that push and pull thing. People, you were saying, were being pushed out of certain parts of other parts of North America into this pretty wild place, right? But they're also pulled by the possibility of economic and political power in a new place.
Mexico was not debating immigration the way we debate it now. It was trying to govern a distant frontier through settlement, but settlement policies rarely produce only the results governments intend.
To invite Anglo-Americans in, maybe it's in their mind solving one problem, but they couldn't have anticipated that by doing that, you're inviting people with different ideas, different ways of living, existing in the world. And those, if that population gets too big, now they're strong enough to be able to, and that, of course, we run into a revolution here, and that's how that panned out.
Yeah, I think that, the power of unintended consequences, right? I mean, there maybe is no more powerful force in history. We are all kind of bewildered by the effects of our own choices, and so that's true in terms of the Mexican government. I think that, how we think about the unintended consequences of mixing with people who are very different from us, really can shape fundamentally our relationship to culture.
By 1828, Mexican officials could see a problem taking shape. General Manuel de Mier y Terán traveled through Texas and warned that Mexican influence weakened the farther east he went. American settlers were building their own schools, trading with the United States, resisting Mexican authority, and arriving faster than Mexico could regulate them. Mexico had tried to govern Texas by populating it, but distance, weak enforcement, slavery, land disputes, language, trade, and culture were pulling many settlements away from Mexico City. Then came the contradiction Mexico could not easily solve. Mexico formally abolished slavery in 1829, but Texas exposed the limits of that law almost immediately. Mexico responded by trying to reassert control. It restricted further immigration from the United States, strengthened military posts, enforced customs duties, and tried to bring Texas more firmly under Mexican authority. But those efforts created even more friction. So the unintended consequence was profound. A policy meant to secure Mexico's northern frontier helped create a population and political crisis Mexico could no longer easily control. Within a few years, that crisis would become the Texas Revolution.
By the time the Texas Revolution was fought, Texas was already a land of many different groups, some rather unexpected. For example, Italians traveled with Coronado through the area as early as 1541, mostly as missionaries. By 1870, nearly 200 Italians were listed in the Texas census, and their numbers climbed steadily into the 20th century. The French traded with natives and Spanish Texans in the 1700s. But the French explorer La Salle had already beaten them here when he landed near Sabine Pass in 1685. 2 years later, his own men killed him at present-day Navasota. Acadians of French origin were just across the Texas-Louisiana border by 1785 and drifted into Texas shortly thereafter. Henri Castro established the French colony of Castroville in 1844. And Orange County, on the Louisiana border in southeast Texas, is more than 30% French Cajun today. But still, by 1836, most Texans were Anglos from America, mostly from the southern states that bordered Texas: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. Texans at the time of the Revolution numbered around 35,000, and 1/10, 3,500, were Tejanos, or Mexican Texans, and some of those fought for Texas independence. About 300 to 400 Tejanos, it amounts to 1 of every 6 soldiers who fought in the Texas Revolution, were Mexican Texans. It may not sound like much, but at a time when soldiers were few and far between for the Texas rebels, The Tejanos were an indispensable addition to the meager band of Anglo-Texans.
By the time of the Texas Revolution, Texas was already more complicated than any single Genesis story. This was not simply an Anglo story, and it was not simply a Mexican story. Tejanos were not background characters in the Revolution. Some fought for Texas independence, and their presence complicates any version of the story that turns Texas into one people against another. But the next chapter was shaped by larger forces too: land, slavery, annexation, and the political power that would come with joining the United States.
To understand the impact of the great sort of the massive migration of African descended people from the upper South to the lower South, this forced migration, that transformed the United States. It created what we think of as kind of the slave economy of the 19th century. It transformed the relationship between the South and the North. It made the Northern economy, industrialization, the first industrialization possible. It created this situation where you have two regions of the country that are economically and socially interdependent upon each other, but developing in fundamentally different paths, right? So one is being built around wage labor and immigration from Europe, and the other one's being built around enslaved labor and poor white labor, and the slavery dominated economy. And so you actually can't understand the annexation of Texas unless you understand the economic and political impulses behind the people who were running what would become the Confederacy, and the desire to have the land of Texas to balance out territory in the North that was growing, free territory in the North. You can't understand the subtle but just deep growing differences between what we now think of as the South and the North, and these kinds of growth of sectional differences, unless you understand the fact that Texas becomes part of this kind of cotton kingdom, becomes part, and it's much more complicated than cotton, by the way, but becomes part of this kind of cotton-dominated political and economic structure in the South.
Well, when our state got annexed, and maybe this is as good a time as any to get into that, I know that they had, or I believe that they had tried to become annexed earlier and were denied, and maybe two times or something of the sort. And when they finally were annexed, I don't recall what was the ultimate reason. I know Manifest Destiny was thrown out there broadly, but
the main goal was political power on the part of expansionist Southerners. I mean, the main goal was that we're going to deal with the consequences that come, and the consequences that would come was increasing the tension, the sectional tension within the United States. People knew that was going to be the consequence, but it was the drive to gain that kind of power, to have the power in the Senate, to have the power in the Electoral College for the presidency, and the power at controlling a state government of a growing place, right? Where now you have 30% of the population by 1860, so it's getting there, right? Is people of African descent who are enslaved labor. We're sitting here, as we sit at Texas State, we're sitting here right on the border between ranch country and the Cotton Kingdom. And so we're sitting, and Austin is sitting on that border. And what they're creating is this kind of tie into a political and economic structure that would become the Confederacy, that's tied to Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, right? There's this kind of growing entity. And the expansionist Southerners, people who sold the notion of Manifest Destiny, right, were selling that as a project to gain power in what they're seeing as really kind of geopolitical contests over what the United States would become.
They were planning for future power to be able to and because the way of life in the North and the way of life in the South were so drastically different, the South saw this as a chance to be able to increase their power, not only with having more land and a more similar way of life, but also within government. Yeah,
and I would say I don't think it's overstating it to say that it was an existential feeling. Increasingly, there was a sense that if you don't defend your ability to have a slave economy, your entire way of life would disappear. The most influential people in Texas and in the South increasingly over the course of the 1840s, 1850s. But going back even into the 1820s and 1830s, really began to believe that if you allowed the politicians of the North, if you allowed the capitalists of the North to be able to take control, you would destroy everything that they thought was good, right? And it became this kind of competition between what they saw as really the best of all possible worlds. It sounds really harsh to our ear that a slave economy, a slave society would be the best of all possible worlds, but they made this direct comparison to the kind of immiserated labor in the factories, and it was actually enslavement that held up the dignity of human beings. I mean, I know that sounds completely counterintuitive to our modern ear, but that's what they were talking about in the 1840s, 1850s, and early 1860s, and that's why they were willing ultimately to go to war, right? People who didn't have a direct economic stake necessarily, or social stake, or social standing based on slavery, saw the slave system itself, the slave South itself, as a positive good in the world, and were afraid of what would come if they were having to be more like the North.
By 1845, movement had already remade Texas. But annexation raised another question. Once people had moved, settled, fought, claimed land, and built power, who would control the institutions that came next? In March of 1845, as annexation moved toward reality, Andrew Jackson wrote to Sam Houston. He celebrated Texas joining the United States, but the letter quickly turned from celebration to instruction.
My dear General, you have yet more to do. You have now to lay the basis by proper legislation and remodeling your Constitution for the future greatness, wealth, and prosperity of your state. To this end, you must shut the door against all foreign grants for land by placing a minimum price on your land and granting, with proper guards and limitations, preemptive rights to actual settlers.
Jackson was not writing about immigration in the modern sense, but he was writing about who would control the future of Texas, who would hold land, whose claims would be protected, whose labor would be valued, and what institutions would shape the new state. But there is a harder truth beneath his language. Not every movement into Texas was voluntary. Not everyone arrived as a settler, and not everyone came with land, law, or political power on their side.
Still, other groups, not official immigrants, had drifted across the borders of present-day Texas earlier in the 18th century to settle, and they mixed and married into Mexican and Spanish families. Some of those undocumented Anglos brought their equally undocumented African slaves with them. So you have black slaves here even before the major influx of enslaved people in the 19th century formed a sizable black presence. By 1860, Black Texans numbered a third of the population, but nearly all were enslaved, thus involuntary immigrants. The Great Migration to the North from 1915 to 1970 saw many Texas blacks leave the discrimination and racism of not only Texas, but most of the South. Today, blacks make up only around 12% of the population, less than half of what it was in freedom. Some major cities, Houston and Dallas, for example, have large black populations forming communities of Black Texans that contribute to the politics of the metro areas and can sway elections in the state during tight contests. In Houston, the 3rd and 5th wards, often referred to as the Tray and the Nickel, were instrumental in sending the late Sylvester Turner to the mayorship of the city for multiple terms. Representative Barbara Jordan galvanized the nation with her speech during the Nixon impeachment hearing in 1974. The list of Black Texans who changed history is legendary and longer than my arm.
The language gets tricky here because the categories do not line up neatly. Some settlers came with permission, some came outside formal permission, some came seeking land and opportunity. But enslaved people did not immigrate to Texas in any meaningful voluntary sense. They were brought by force, and that forced migration became central to the economy and politics of Texas, and black movement did not end there. After emancipation, Black Texans built communities, moved for work and safety, left during the Great Migration, and later, in many cases, returned to the South. So this story is not one direction. It is forced movement, chosen movement, movement toward opportunity, and movement back toward home.
So you're thinking about the great migrations of African Americans from the South to Midwestern, Northeastern cities and the West.
Post-Civil War?
Yeah, I mean, it's slow trickles of Upper South migrants in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It's really World War I that jumpstarts what we call the Great Migrations. 1915 to the 1970s, and actually maybe we want to touch on that later when we're thinking about cities in Texas, because there's a reverse migration that happens after the 1970s back into the South. But people have assumed that the people who were moving during the Great Black Migrations were running away from Jim Crow, and to a certain extent that was true. But through really sophisticated sort of qualitative and quantitative research, historians have shown that actually the sort of the aspirational goals of the people who were moving were stronger as migration impulses than was the push of the sort of the running away from Jim Crow.
Okay.
Nobody, I think, there's this sort of it goes back to Robert Johnston, this sort of story about like moving to California. You know, Chicago is California, right? That the people were seeking the promised land, and they were. I don't think anybody really had expectations once they got to Chicago that it was going to be that ideal space. And then they wrote letters back and said, okay, it's this complicated space, but you can get a job in packing houses, you can get a job in the steel mills, you can get a job carrying coal, which is something that you could get your kids educated. You could have your own space in a neighborhood with people who look like you. Again, there's this kind of sense of seeking opportunity. And I think that's true, too, in terms of the migrations into Texas, with some really important exceptions of forced migrations that I think have already been mentioned.
The Mexican-American ratio has significantly changed in the modern era. For the first time in our history, in 2023, the Hispanic population of the state was greater than the Anglo population, and Hispanic women made up the largest demographic group in the state. Combined with 12% of Black Texans, 5.6% of Asians, and a meager 1% of indigenous peoples and Anglos became a minority group. But it is a minority group that runs the show in Texas. Anglos hold more public offices, control more of the state's wealth, enforce the law, live in the highest income neighborhoods, and rent more of the offices and high-rise buildings in the state's major cities than any other group.
Population change does not automatically create equal political or economic power. So demographics tell us one part of the story. They tell us who is here and in what numbers. But culture often shows the change more clearly.
The influence of the Hispanic communities throughout Texas is clearly visible across the state and nation. Mi Tierra in the San Antonio Mercado started as a 3-table corner eatery over 80 years ago. The old Barunda Cafe in Marfa dates back to 1887. Galveston's original Mexican cafe opened in 1916, while El Phoenix, founded in 1918, is the oldest continuously operating Mexican restaurant chain in Texas. But Asian populations in Texas have also had a major impact on the state's history. They were recruited as early as the 1870s to build railroads in Texas. Chinese workers built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. Coming from the east, the railroad workers were largely Irish, giving rise to the slogan that the Transcontinental Railroad was built on Irish whiskey and Chinese tea. In 1870, 250 Chinese laborers were recruited to work on the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. Another 2,600 came in 1881 to build the Southern Pacific sections in the western parts of the state. Most probably didn't settle here, though. In a more recent immigration, Asians of Vietnamese nationality arrived in Texas as a result of the 1975 fall of the Saigon regime in the Vietnam War. Many who had supported the American military in Vietnam were forced to leave as the North Vietnamese Army took over southern Vietnam. Sometimes called, quote, boat people, unquote. That group has expanded to slightly over 1% of the Texas population, the second largest group of citizens of Vietnamese extraction in the country. California has more. Vietnamese Texans make up nearly 19% of Asian Texans, and Vietnamese is the third most often spoken language in Texas. A large segment of that population settled on the Texas Gulf Coast and entered the commercial fishing business in seaside communities like Rockport, Port Aransas, and others. Texas came into the Union in 1845, so the first official census was done in 1850. That census documented a significant German population in Texas that had begun to arrive in the Republic in the mid-1840s, and by 1850 was the second largest group of white settlers, outnumbering the migration of northern Anglos into Texas. New Braunfels was founded in 1845 by German Prince Karl of Solms-Braunfels, but others followed, establishing German communities throughout the central Texas area. What Mexican food did for Texas cuisine, the German communities and bakeries did for German food. Chicken fried steak actually began as a German replacement for German fried schnitzel. Sauerbraten, red cabbage, German potato salad, along with a large variety of German beers, dot menus across the state. Food, along with public education and other integrated institutions and families, have blended so much of the state. It has advanced so far that even the foods are blended. For example, one Austin restaurant is named Ramen del Barrio, while San Marcos is home to Dos Gatos, Spanish for two cats, and specializes in Czech kolaches. But we still aren't done with the motley crew. There are other groups. The Czechs, Romanians, Poles, various Central Asian groups, and many others live in Texas, attend Texas schools, and contribute to our politics, culture, society, literature, economy, cuisine, and history. If you've driven Texas and wondered about some of the old, lovely small churches that dot the rural landscape, you are probably seeing churches built, owned, and maintained by the ancestors of some of those groups. When you drive into the south of Houston and look at the street signs, you will notice they changed to both English and kanji.
Texas is a place where people come from all over the world. I mean, you know, Houston is one of the most diverse places in the entire United States, right? And it's one of the great cities of the United States precisely because people are coming from all over the world and doing these, kind of building communities, creating new kinds of work, creating new kinds of economic opportunities, creating new kinds of cultures, these syncretic cultures, right? So, you know, the actual on the ground experience of a place like Houston, right, really calls into question the political slogans of the people who are in our, and I'm talking about both parties.
Yeah.
I'm saying that what parties tend to do, what politicians tend to do, understandably, because they have to get people to rally around an action, voting for them, right? They simplify these things. And what I think we can do in our everyday life is to make decisions to recognize the complexities and maybe not let their stories be the stories that determine the way we think about our neighbors.
Yeah, and as average citizens, it is very clear to me that when we are in the act of just day-to-day life, that these problems are less problematic. But it's when they tack words like the crisis of immigration. Well, that word is pretty charged. So, and then I can see probably people are out there going, I didn't know there was a crisis.
Texas has welcomed newcomers, depended on newcomers, resisted newcomers, exploited newcomers, and been changed by newcomers. That is the lived contradiction of Texas.
Attend a university graduation ceremony in San Marcos or Austin and just look at the jumbo screen at the names. Sadly, many of these immigrants have not been welcomed in Texas. For many, prejudice and violence have been more common than smiles, welcoming handshakes, and job offers. The Vietnamese boat people were so opposed in some areas, they literally all moved to more welcoming neighborhoods. Racial animosity against brown and black Texans has been a part of our culture and legal past since the beginning of the state's history. Yet the contributions these groups have made to make Texas are incredible. Other Texans have faced life-threatening and now and then life-ending violence. Texan warfare virtually ended many indigenous communities in Texas and forced others to move on. German Texans were so threatened during World War I. Some were hanged in North Texas, and others forced to change their names. Muellers became Millers. Schneiders became Sniders.
It seems like when these changes happen, people that have lived in a certain place forever or their whole lives, they sometimes have some type of disdain, or they develop some type of disdain about what change they're seeing. And I can't tell or put my finger on it exactly. Some people will start stories like, when I was a kid, it was like ... And the outcome of their story is to either prove that it was better then than it is now, or it's to say, no, that's just what it was when I was a kid. It's not like that now. And so, but I think we do run into a lot of that, especially in current times, where people are looking back towards something to try to conserve or preserve.
Yeah, no, that's I hate to be too academic about this, but like one of my favorite books that I've read is John Hyam's Strangers in the Land, 1951, right? He writes this book about nativism in the United States, which is part of there are many different ways that people are afraid of change, I think. But since we're talking about immigration, this sort of like this notion that only the native born are worthy of full standing in society, right, is one of the most common sort of political phenomenon in the United States. And he describes it to kind of waves of an epidemic, that if you trace American history over the long course of its past, you see these kinds of outbreaks of nativism in various times. So you think about sort of the Irish immigrations of the 19th century, and then again, after the Civil War with massive European immigrations, you have the rise of nativism, and it has something to do with kind of this tension between old settlers and new settlers, and I think it has something to do with the way that people imagine newcomers. And I think we've been, as a society, we've been struggling to figure out how to describe people who are coming into our communities, like. Are they the uprooted, right? Are they just like completely lost, and they are this naive kind of rural folk who don't know how to act, and we look down on them? They ought to be educated to be more looking like us, right? Are they the transplanted people who are kind of heroic for picking themselves up and recreating what they wanted to do before, right? Either way, they're bringing ideas about food, about family, about religion, about how to make a living, about how to get married and have baptisms and die, right, and celebrate somebody's life. I mean, they're fundamentally challenging the very sort of fabric of the way people exist in the world. And so it takes some real effort. I mean, I know we're jumping around a lot here, but the famous, we had Cabeza de Vaca brought up. I mean, one of the famous parts of his story is that he really gets educated in his 8 years in the wilderness about how complex human beings are, and then goes back and has trouble explaining that to his fellow Spaniards, right? So there's this kind of like learning process that has to happen, and I do think that. Joe mentioned that there was a kind of a tradition of public education that came to Texas, right? And I do, obviously I'm a public school university professor. I send my kids to public schools. My wife is the president of the school board, right? We're invested in public schools, and that's because I think that kind of broad education is one of the things that allows us to have enough imagination about and enough curiosity about other people, so that when we are kind of having that knee-jerk reaction to difference, we're able to overcome it.
Without the contributions of all Texans, this state would not be the myth-making, myth-busting, cultural behemoth it is. We aren't one thing or one idea. We are the mixture of the parts that make the whole. On that note, and with firm conviction, Lone Star Lore declares that Texas history belongs to every last one of the over 32 million of us Texans. We rejoice in being a glorious, motley, Heinz 57 variety bunch.
Maybe that is the honest version of Texas pride, not pretending the story has always been glorious, but instead refusing to leave anyone out of it. Texas was made by movement, and movement always carries costs in the forms of memory, conflict, adaptation, loss, and change. There is a Ray Bradbury story called Dark They Were and Golden-Eyed about Earth people who settle on Mars. At first, they try to recreate the world they'd left behind. Same houses, same habits, same language, same names, but slowly, the place changes them. Their children change first, their words change, their memories change. Even their names begin to belong less to Earth and more to Mars. Bradbury does not make that change simple. One character fears it, others accept it. The story does not ask us to declare the change good or bad. It asks us to notice that place changes people and people change place. Of course, Texas is not Mars, and Texans are not Martians, but every migration story carries that same tension. History does not give us an easy answer, but it does give us a clearer sense of what Texas has been and what kind of place it is still becoming. Our thanks to Dr. Jeffrey Helgeson and Joleene Maddox Snider for helping us think through this long history of movement in Texas. Next time this history becomes personal, we turn from the broad story of movement to one man's story, the story of Julio Galvez, next time on Lone Star Lore.